Well, good morning, everyone. Tim Baker's my name. I want to just talk a little bit about recruitment as a very important issue. And I think some of the things that are evolving around recruitment, I think are important. And I think as we come out of COVID, we all know that the world is changing at a great rate of knots. And however your organization is probably not likely to be the organization, the same organization in a couple of years' time. And this goes to the heart of recruitment, and it does raise the issue of whether or not we should be recruiting on the basis of past performance, which is, of course, the traditional way we do recruit, or should we be recruiting on future potential? And I think it should be the latter, and I think we should be making deliberate efforts to do that. And for the very reason that past performance won't necessarily predict future performance if the whole organization is different and the world that we're living in is different. This is particularly the case for leadership. So let me share my slides and then we'll launch into the presentation. Okay, so look, if you don't know who I am, just a bit of a quick overview to assist you. You can see that I'm an author. I've written 16 books. And one of those books is The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential, which has just been released. And so I've taken a chapter out of that book to talk about today. You can see I'm also a keynote speaker and I also present in workshops. You can see up on the top right-hand corner, I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brizzy, and we only play every second week because it takes 2 weeks at my age to recover. And you can see that gentleman chasing me. You'd be running as fast as I am there if he was chasing you as well. All right, so that's a bit about me. So let's talk about the topic itself. And I think one of the key questions that you might have on your mind, because you've obviously shown an interest in the topic, is isn't behavioural interviewing the best way to select the right candidate for a vacant position? Now, of course, for those who don't know, behavioural interviewing is a technique where we draw on the candidate's past performance or examples of their past performance to make some judgments about how they might be able to cope with the job that's on offer at the time. And so behavioural interviewing is the technique to draw upon that past performance to make sense of future selection processes. I think it's what my take on this is that behavioural interviewing is a good technique, but I think the content of what we're actually asking needs to change. So I'm not sure about the sort of typical question of, can you give me an example when you were doing X or Y? Trouble is, X or Y may not be applicable in 2 or 3 years' time. So I think what we need to do is to feed in a different set of questions in our interviewing. But I think the behavioural technique is a reasonable technique. It's just that it's too focused on competencies. It's too focused on, have you done this before? And if you have, can you give me an example? And I think that kind of thing is dangerous now because the world is changing at such a great rate of knots that the content perhaps needs to change. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Now, what I want to cover here is, what do I mean by future potential? Because I think it's all very well talking about that, but what actually does that mean? And then I'd like to talk a little bit about what those characteristics look like. So, it's a bit of a vague term, isn't it? So what do we actually mean by future potential? And at the end of the presentation here, I've got a special offer that I'll share with you shortly at the end. And we're only 30 minutes maximum here today. So we're just going to touch on the subject. So let's start with future potential. Now, just before I do that, I'm sure you're aware that there is an employee life cycle, and The employee life cycle, I think, is a very good place to start when you're looking at unlocking human potential in organizations. And the reason why I say that is it's not likely to change this structure. So lots of things in the workplace will change. But one thing we're pretty sure that won't change is this kind of process that people go through when they enter an organization. So, for example, the first step, of course, is that people are recruited and there's a selection decision that's made and a candidate is selected, whether that candidate be outside the organization or inside the organization. We have to go through some process to make sure we get the right candidate. So that's not likely to change anytime soon. And of course, once they come on board, we've got to provide induction and onboarding. And I think that's dramatically improved over the last 25 years. I still think there's a long way to go, and I don't have scope today to talk about that. But in some of my other sessions, I talk about that and what needs to happen. And of course, when the successful person is on board and they get their feet under the desk or whatever they're doing, the next real step is about developing them so that they can do their current and future jobs more effectively. So, of course, that's definitely part of the process. And again, I think there's some significant changes that are needed there, because I think the focus is too much on a job-centered approach to learning and development, whilst jobs and doing jobs and executing them is extremely important, obviously. I think there are a whole range of other dimensions that are necessary. And I think my estimate is about 80% of the expenditure in organizations goes towards improving people's capacity to do their current job. Now, of course, we want to reward people, and, we use, conditions and salary and other extrinsic forms of motivation to do that. But we also promote people, and unfortunately, we're still promoting leaders on the basis of technical know-how, which we all know is not the way to do it. But for some reason, we still believe that if you're a good engineer, you'll make a good engineering manager, which of course is not necessarily the case, as we all know. So there's obviously improvements that are necessary there. And of course, when people leave, they normally subject themselves to an exit interview. And during that exit interview, they normally will tell the HR personnel precisely why they're leaving, what the real reason is. And that can be useful data for planning for the future. But I think the problem that we've had in the past, or still do to a certain degree, is we just let people go and we don't keep in contact with them. And of course, professional services firms have done this extremely well, where they stay in touch with their so-called alumni. And so, because you never know when there's a short-term vacancy that's required, and a person to fill a short-term vacancy. And if we keep in touch with our people, that can be very useful. So I don't think this is ever going to change, or certainly not in the foreseeable future. All of these things are critical to an employee's success. So I pitched the whole book around this whole employee life cycle. But obviously what we're talking about today is recruitment and selection. So let's do that a little bit more in a bit more detail. So what actually do we mean by future potential? What is it that we're really talking about here? Well, one definition might be that it's how quickly and effectively a person can adapt and respond to changes in their surrounding work environment. That, to me, is the essence of what future potential is. Because let's face it, the only thing we know for sure is that things are going to be chopping and changing dramatically in the future. So if we've got people who can adapt to those situations more readily than perhaps someone who's set in their ways, then that's obviously going to be an asset to your organization, your business, your company. So we were looking for people who are flexible and adaptable and malleable, and because we know that that's what the future is all about. And we all can think of people instantly who are very set in their ways, This is the way we do things. This is how we do it. And of course, those people ultimately become redundant because, you know, the world changes so quickly. AI gets involved, or processes change, priorities change, markets change, whatever it might be. And that person, of course, is left in a very difficult position. So it's obviously a life skill for any employee to learn to be adaptable. But I think when we're recruiting people, we need to make sure we do that. So the question is, how do you do that? Because obviously people will say certain things in interviews. How do we actually know for sure that someone can quickly and effectively adapt to a new circumstance? That becomes critically important. This is particularly important, I might say, for leaders, because leaders, of course, set the tone for their own team and their own departments. So what are these factors? Now, I call these X factors, but you could, you know, call them whatever you want, but I don't think you disagree with my proposition here, that if we drill that down a bit further and say, well, okay, adaptability, I understand, is really important. So what are the ingredients that make that up? And I think, you know, from my own sort of reading and my own observation in the world of work as a consultant with 20 years experience, I would say that a drive to excel is critically important. And, you know, because obviously people who are hungry to achieve, well, that's going to be important, because by having that hunger, they will certainly be willing to be more adaptable in order, you know, if there's another way of getting from point A to point B, let's find out what it might be. We want people who are hungry to learn. And of course, most of us, if we ask people, they say, are you committed to learning, lifelong learning? They say yes, but we all know that that's not necessarily the case. We want people who are continually curious about themselves and willing to upgrade and develop themselves. So we need to focus on those sorts of things when we're interviewing people. Entrepreneurial, enterprising spirit. We want people who are not set in a single way. We want people who are adaptable because they come at the problem or the situation in different ways. That becomes extremely important. And we want people who are dynamic and can shift and change and pivot quickly. So those are some of the factors that we're looking for in a future workplace. And you might say, well, what about technical capabilities? Well, of course, we want people who have technical capabilities, but you can imagine that when you're interviewing somebody, you've probably got 5 people who've got technical capabilities. Well, I'd hope so. So you're not really going to separate them on the basis of technical capability necessarily. It's where I think you should separate them is around these X factors. Let's look at some more of those factors and just see what I'm talking about there. We do know from research that there are 5 key success indicators. So if you're looking at people in the world of work, sport, art, politics, business, whatever it might be, we can distill it down to 5 important things. And I think if you focus on these things in your selection process, you'll be better off. So what does the right motivation mean? Now, the right motivation, what I'm talking about there is that you can get people who are very self-centered and selfish and striving to succeed at the expense of other people. That's not what I'm talking about. The right motivation means that people are wanting to achieve, but they want to do that in a collaborative way. See the difference? I'm not interested in individual motivation. I am interested in collaborative motivation. I want to see people supporting other people, but all in the interests of achieving an end result, because we've all seen selfish people, and that's not what I'm getting at there. So that's why I say the right motivation. Curiosity, of course, is that people are willing to ask lots and lots and lots of questions, that they're always playing devil's advocate. They're always willing to challenge conventional wisdom. And we're looking for people like that. And there's a good reason for that, because if we don't find people like that, then there's no catalyst for change. And that's a problem. We're also looking for people who have insight, who can bring, different ways of thinking to the workplace. So I think often I say to people in recruitment and selection, it's not as much of a risk to select someone outside your industry as you might think, particularly in leadership roles, because those people are bringing to that role an insight into other ways of doing things. We want people who will engage. We want people who are team players. We want people who are leaders who will engage their team. I'm sure, that's a no-brainer pretty much. And of course, we want people who are determined. We want people who will see things through and not just give up at the first sight of a problem. So those are the 5 indicators. Now, you can apply that to anything, but I think this gives you a little bit more of a sense of what you're looking for when you're actually selecting a candidate. So the question is, how do you do that? Well, there are a couple of diagnostics that are out there now, and I anticipate there'll be quite a lot more diagnostics out there in the future that are good diagnostics around future potential. So I would suggest to you, instead of doing the good old IQ test or whatever you've been doing for the last 20 years, perhaps you might want to invest in a diagnostic that looks at future potential. That might be useful, and it'll give you an indicator or a sense of whether or not these attributes are actually part of the person's makeup. So I'd use some diagnostics to help you. I would also shape my questions in the interview around these 5 success factors. And if I can, now not all of them, because obviously you do need to know, some of the technical capabilities that a person does. So I still need to know all that, but I don't need 100% of questions about that. What I want to know is about these things, because these are the things that will sustain you in the future. As you know, I'm sure it's not rocket science, and I'm sure you'd agree with me that those 5 indicators are critically important to anybody's success. So here is a very interesting insight into that. I just read this through. It's a little longer quote, but I think it just encapsulates precisely what I'm trying to talk about here this morning. Potential is the most important predictor of success at all levels, from junior management to C-suite and the board. I'm convinced that organizations and their leaders must transition to what I think of as a new era of talent spotting, one in which their evaluations of one another are based not on brawn, brains, experience, or competencies, but on potential. So that kind of sums up, from an expert in that field, what we need to concentrate on and why we need to concentrate on that. So I think that's the essence of my message this morning, that we really need to start looking at things other than people's past experience and their competencies. If we get trapped in that place, we'll never get the people that will help us get to the next level. And that's the critical point there. So I think these things are extremely important. And, the good news for you is that it's not going to take much to tinker with your recruitment and selection processes to get this right. Perhaps you might engage a survey, one of these diagnostics. You just have to Google some of them and you'll find that they're out there. There's 2 that I know of. Go and sort of investigate those. I'd introduce them into your process. And I would also make sure that there's a set of generic questions that are asked around those 5 success indicators that I mentioned earlier, to make sure that we are recruiting on the basis of future potential, not past experience. And coming back to the comment that I made earlier about behavioral interviewing, of course, you can still ask people, can you give me an example of where you were not sure of how something worked, and you asked a number of questions which opened up new learning for you. You know, that's on curiosity, and you can tailor some questions around that very easily, I would have thought. So I guess the takeaways for you are these: use diagnostics to measure potential. So they are out there, and I predict that there'll be many, many more, because obviously this is definitely where recruitment is going. Ask questions at the interview and to referees that are based on future potential. So just change the shape of the questions, because I think if you change the shape of the questions, you'll get different answers. And in fact, you'll get the answers that you want, which is about, you know, recruiting on future potential. And I think also offer learning and development programs to foster these attributes of future potential. So I think within your organization, to cultivate a culture around future potential, you should have some L&D programs running which are really focused on these 5 attributes. Now, the question might be, you know, can you actually train somebody to be curious? Can you train somebody to be determined? Well, I think you can, to a certain degree. I mean, obviously there's some attributes that people possess, but I think you can nurture those things to some degree. So, but in order to do that, of course, you've got to have a program that focuses on those things. And if you don't have a program that focuses on those things, then the message that you're sending is that those things aren't very important here. We just want you to get on and do your job. Okay, so that's pretty much it from me. Now, I just wanted to mention to you that every Friday, if you're not aware, I do have one of these regular sessions, always at the same time. And next Friday, I'm going to focus on job crafting and how it can be applied. So you're more than welcome to attend that. All you've got to do, as you can see, it's on the 4th of November. I'll be sending you a copy of the slides sometime today, and you just click on the link there, and as you did today, you'll be registered and you can join me for that conversation. I think job crafting has got tremendous potential in the world that we're living in now, if we do it in a very overt way, and there's a way of doing it. So I want to talk about that next week. And finally, as I said, there's a special offer that I have for you, because if you'd like to purchase my book, The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential, it's out now on Amazon. And if you go to Amazon, certainly in Australia, it'll cost you $39 plus postage. But if you send me an email today, I can furnish you with the book for $22 plus postage, and I'll sign it for you and get it out to you ASAP. So that's my little special offer for you for taking time out of your busy Friday schedule to be here today. So folks, that's about it from me. I'll just stop sharing for a moment. Thanks for the opportunity of working with you. I hope you found that useful. I hope it was thought-provoking. And as I said earlier, it's just a mindset shift. It's not a major change you've got to take internally just to rejig your recruitment and selection processes, to focus on this whole concept of future potential, so that you don't get caught up in a situation where you're just recruiting for the status quo. So thanks, everyone. I've enjoyed working with you. Stay tuned. I'll be sending you an email shortly with the slides and a recording. And of course, if you'd like a copy of the book, just send me an email and I'll make that happen for you. Thanks, everyone. All the best. Have a wonderful weekend, and perhaps we'll catch you next Friday. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.